For years, Bigfoot sightings have been written off as innocent encounters with a reclusive woodland giant, with most reports featuring quick glimpses and echoing howls from a beast that seems to avoid human contact at all costs. Today, we're going to examine the most scary Bigfoot sightings you will ever see. Encounters so violently terrifying and aggressively predatory that seasoned park rangers refuse to patrol certain trails alone, and search and rescue teams have quietly marked entire forest sections as no-go zones after witnessing something that defied every natural law they thought they understood. On February 14, 2019, a routine winter patrol over Washington's North Cascades would become anything but routine for helicopter crew N-47. The three-person team consisted of pilot Jake Morrison, a 15-year veteran with over 8,000 flight hours in mountain terrain, flight medic Lily Chu, certified in wilderness emergency medicine, and park ranger Tom Bradley, who had spent 12 years patrolling the remote wilderness areas of the Pacific Northwest. The morning briefing indicated clear skies with temperatures hovering around 18 degrees Fahrenheit. Wind conditions were favorable at 8 miles per hour from the southwest. The crew's mission was standard: conduct aerial surveillance of backcountry areas, check on registered climbing parties, and maintain visual contact with emergency beacons from solo hikers who had filed permits for the Valentine's Day weekend. At approximately 10:47 a.m., while conducting a sweep of the Cascade River drainage, Flight Medic Chu noticed an anomaly on the helicopter's thermal imaging display. The system showed a large heat signature moving through a snow-covered valley approximately 2 miles northeast of their position. The signature appeared significantly larger than typical wildlife and was moving in an erratic pattern through snow that ground reports indicated was 3 to 4 feet deep. Initial assessment suggested an injured hiker or climber in distress. The figure appeared to be struggling through the deep powder, leaving what looked like a disturbed trail behind it. Radio communications with base confirmed no registered climbing parties in that specific sector, and no emergency beacons were active in the immediate area. Weather conditions were beginning to deteriorate. Cloud cover was moving in from the west, and wind speeds were increasing. Standard protocol would typically call for marking the GPS coordinates and requesting ground-based search and rescue teams. However, given the remote location and the apparent distress of the individual, the crew made the decision to attempt immediate visual contact and possible rescue. This decision would prove to be one they would question for years to come. As helicopter N-47 descended toward the valley floor, the crew began to realize that their initial assessment was dramatically incorrect. Through the aircraft's windows, what they observed defied their collective experience in wilderness rescue operations. The figure moving through the snow stood approximately 8.5 feet tall. Its entire body was covered in dark, matted hair that appeared almost black against the white snow. The creature's build was massive, with shoulders that seemed nearly 4 feet across and arms that hung well below what would be normal proportions for a human being. Ranger Bradley, who had investigated numerous Sasquatch reports during his tenure with the Park Service, immediately recognized the similarities to witness descriptions he had documented over the years. The creature's gait was distinctly bipedal, but unlike human locomotion. It moved with a rolling motion, each step sinking deep into the snow, but covering remarkable distance with each stride. As the helicopter descended to approximately 200 feet above the valley floor, the crew observed a trail of what appeared to be blood droplets in the snow behind the creature. The crimson spots were clearly visible against the white backdrop, suggesting the being was indeed injured. The blood trail extended back through the forest for several hundred yards, indicating the creature had been traveling in this condition for some time. The sound of the helicopter's rotors appeared to agitate the creature significantly. It stopped its forward progress and turned toward the aircraft, raising what the crew described as an enormous head to look directly at them. At this point, the being's behavior shifted from apparent distress to clear aggression. Moving with surprising speed for something of its size, the creature bent down and grasped a boulder that Bradley estimated to weigh at least 60 pounds. With fluid motion that demonstrated incredible strength and coordination, it hurled the projectile directly at the helicopter. The accuracy of the throw was remarkable. The boulder struck the tail rotor assembly with devastating force, immediately causing severe vibration throughout the aircraft. Pilot Morrison fought to maintain control as warning lights illuminated across the instrument panel. The tail rotor, critical for directional control, had suffered significant damage. Within seconds, Morrison realized that controlled flight was no longer possible. He initiated emergency landing procedures, auto-rotating the aircraft toward a relatively flat area of the valley floor. The helicopter struck the snow with considerable force, the landing skids digging deep into the powder. The main rotor blades struck snow-covered tree branches, causing additional damage, but the crew compartment remained intact. All 3 crew members survived the impact with only minor injuries. Chu sustained a mild concussion and lacerations to her forehead from loose equipment. Bradley suffered bruised ribs from his safety harness, and Morrison experienced minor whiplash. However, their aircraft was completely disabled, and they found themselves stranded in a remote valley with a creature of unknown intentions somewhere in the immediate vicinity. The immediate priority was establishing communication with their base station. Morrison activated the emergency locator beacon, while Chu assessed the crew's medical condition and Bradley conducted a security perimeter check around the crash site. The distress signal indicated their position, but weather conditions meant rescue operations would likely be delayed by 4 to 6 hours. During his perimeter check, Bradley made a discovery that would haunt him for years. The blood trail they had observed from the air continued past their crash site, leading deeper into the forest. More significantly, he found footprints in the snow that measured approximately 18 inches in length and 7 inches in width. The depth of the impressions suggested something weighing between 600 and 800 pounds. Against standard emergency protocol, which called for remaining with the aircraft until rescue arrived, the crew made the decision to follow the trail. Bradley argued that documenting the creature's path might provide valuable evidence, while Chu was concerned about the extent of its injuries based on the amount of blood they were observing. The trail led them through dense forest for approximately half a mile. The blood drops became more frequent, and the footprints showed signs that the creature was favoring its left side. Broken branches at heights of 7 to 8 feet indicated the being's passage through areas where humans would need to duck or crawl. The trail ended abruptly at the edge of a cliff face that dropped approximately 150 feet to a rocky stream bed below. The blood trail stopped at the cliff's edge, but there was no body visible in the ravine below. The crew spent nearly an hour searching the area and examining the cliff face for any sign of where the creature might have gone, but found no additional evidence. When the search and rescue team arrived at 4:23 p.m., they extracted the crew without incident and documented the crash site. A second investigative team was dispatched the following day to examine the blood trail and footprint evidence. Their report confirmed the presence of both blood samples and large footprints, but noted that no creature was located despite an extensive search of the area. During the mandatory debriefing process, the crew's account of their encounter was met with skepticism from supervisory personnel. The official position was that the stress of the emergency landing had caused the crew to misinterpret what they had observed. The creature they described was dismissed as likely being a large bear standing on its hind legs, and the accuracy of the thrown boulder was attributed to coincidence rather than deliberate action. Photographs of the footprints and blood samples were taken by the investigative team, but the results of laboratory analysis were classified and never released to the crew. Multiple requests for information under the Freedom of Information Act were denied on grounds of ongoing investigation. The official incident report attributed the helicopter crash to mechanical failure of the tail rotor assembly, making no mention of the boulder impact or the creature encounter. Insurance claims were processed based on this mechanical failure determination. The psychological impact on the crew was significant. All 3 members underwent mandatory counseling sessions, and their accounts remained consistent throughout multiple interviews. However, the official dismissal of their experience created lasting professional and personal consequences. Ranger Bradley requested transfer to a different district within 6 months of the incident, citing his inability to continue working in an area where his professional observations were not taken seriously. Flight Medic Chu left wilderness rescue work entirely, accepting a position with an urban emergency medical service. Pilot Morrison continued flying like nothing happened. The case remains officially closed, but questions persist about what really happened in that remote valley on February 14, 2019, and whether the truth about the encounter will ever be fully acknowledged. Marcus Velez had been hunting these mountains for over 20 years. At 44, the Missoula native knew the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness like his own backyard. The remote section he'd chosen for this October hunt was notorious for producing trophy elk, but it required a 3-hour hike from the nearest trail access. Most hunters avoided the area due to its isolation, which made it perfect for someone seeking solitude and big game. His satellite phone buzzed as he secured the final strap on his tree stand, 15 feet above the forest floor. The device was his lifeline to civilization, capable of sending messages and making calls, even in the deepest wilderness. Marcus had invested in the technology after his wife Sarah insisted on emergency communication during his solo hunts. He texted Sarah at 4:30 p.m. on October 12, 2016. Setup complete. Stand is solid, weather looks good. This spot has fresh elk sign everywhere. Should have meat in the freezer by Sunday. The first evening passed without incident. Marcus settled into his elevated position as darkness crept through the towering pines. His voice message to Sarah that night reflected his optimism. He told her that the first day had gone smoothly, that he'd seen a few does, but was waiting for a larger buck. The weather, he said, was perfect, and he felt confident about the morning hunt. He ended the message by telling her he loved her. But the second night brought changes that would haunt the investigation for years to come. Marcus's voice message to his brother Jake, recorded at 11:47 p.m., carried a different tone entirely. The confident hunter now sounded uncertain, almost confused. He explained that something strange was happening near his stand. Heavy footsteps circling below him, too deliberate to be random. Each time he aimed his light downward, the sound stopped. When he turned it off, it started again. He said he'd hunted for decades and never heard anything like it. He mentioned it was probably a bear, but admitted the pattern felt wrong, almost as if whatever was down there knew exactly where he was. The next morning brought no relief. Marcus's text to his hunting partner Tom showed his growing unease. He wrote that the forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. As if every animal had vanished overnight. He admitted he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, and that the hair on the back of his neck had been standing up since dawn. By the second night, Marcus's communications took on a desperate quality. His voice message to Jake, time-stamped 1:23 a.m., captured audio that would later become central to the investigation. Marcus's next message to his brother was strained and urgent. He said something was moving around below his tree stand, not a bear or an elk, pacing in circles for nearly an hour. The noises it made were unlike anything he recognized, a deep, throaty mix between a growl and a whistle. He explained that he was recording the sounds so his brother could hear them for himself. The satellite phone's memory contained a 3-minute audio file from that night. The recording captured Marcus's labored breathing, the creak of his tree stand, and underneath it all, a series of vocalizations that defied easy classification. The sounds were rhythmic, almost conversational, as if something was attempting to communicate. Wildlife experts who later analyzed the audio could not identify the source, noting that the vocalizations contained frequencies both higher and lower than any known North American predator. By the third day, Marcus's messages showed a clear shift. The calm, methodical hunter was unraveling. His final unsent text to Tom, likely blocked by weak satellite signal, described massive handprints pressed into the bark of his tree, each one larger than his by several inches. Deep gouges marked the trunk beneath them, as if made by clawed fingers. He wrote that he planned to stay in the stand through the day and wouldn't climb down until full daylight returned. His draft messages, recovered from the phone's memory, revealed the full extent of his terror. One unsent text to Sarah described eyes that didn't reflect like those of a normal animal. They were too high off the ground and seemed to move with awareness. He wrote that he believed whatever was out there knew he was trapped in his stand. Another incomplete draft instructed that if anything happened to him, authorities should check the trees around his position for claw marks, warning that it wasn't a normal predator, but something entirely different. The final coherent communication from Marcus came at 6:45 p.m. on October 14th. His voice message to Sarah tried to sound reassuring, though the strain in his tone was unmistakable. He told her he planned to stay in his stand through the night, explaining that he felt safer off the ground and had enough supplies until morning. He ended the message by telling her not to worry if she didn't hear from him until sunrise and that he loved her. At 2:47 a.m. on October 15th, Marcus's satellite phone registered one final activity, a draft text message that was never sent. The message contained only 4 words, "It's watching me now." When Marcus failed to check in at his scheduled 8 a.m. call, Sarah contacted the local sheriff's office. A search and rescue team reached his hunting area by helicopter that afternoon, following GPS coordinates from his last known position. What they found defied explanation. Marcus lay at the base of his tree, his neck broken from the fall. The rope ladder that provided access to his stand hung in tatters, showing deep gouges that appeared to be claw marks. The spacing and depth of the marks suggested something with immense strength had systematically destroyed the ladder, effectively trapping Marcus in his elevated position before somehow bringing him down. The tree trunk bore additional evidence of the struggle. Bark was stripped away in long vertical gouges, as if something had climbed the tree with considerable force. Most disturbing were the handprints Marcus had mentioned in his texts, clear impressions in the soft bark that measured nearly 10 inches from palm to fingertip. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, the forensic pathologist who examined Marcus's body, noted several anomalies in her preliminary report. While the cause of death was clearly the fall, the positioning of the body suggested it had been moved after impact. Additionally, Marcus's hunting rifle remained in his stand, fully loaded and unfired, despite his reputation as an expert marksman who never hesitated to defend himself. The official investigation concluded within a week. Sheriff's Deputy Robert Torres filed the final report, listing Marcus's death as an accidental fall during night hunting activities. The report made no mention of the audio recordings, the claw marks on the ladder, or the unexplained handprints on the tree. However, when the 3-minute audio file from Marcus's satellite phone was eventually released, it immediately drew criticism from analysts and skeptics. Audio experts argued that the recorded sounds were inconclusive, possibly a mix of wind distortion, distant animal calls, and microphone interference. Online forums dissected every frequency spike, with some claiming manipulation or pareidolia, while others insisted the tone and rhythm pointed to an unknown vocal source. Sarah's attempts to push for a more thorough investigation met with bureaucratic resistance at every turn. Her requests for information were denied, her calls to state wildlife officials went unreturned, and her hired private investigator was told that the case file had been sealed indefinitely. Other hunters began coming forward with similar experiences in the same area. Tom Rodriguez, Marcus's hunting partner, reported that he had encountered unexplained vocalizations and the sensation of being watched during a hunt in the adjacent valley just 2 weeks before Marcus's death. A group of elk hunters from Spokane described finding large footprints and claw marks on trees throughout the region, evidence they had photographed but were later asked to delete by Forest Service officials. Within 6 months of Marcus's death, the entire section of the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness where he had been hunting was quietly closed to public access. Official notices cited concerns about unstable terrain and wildlife management activities, but no specific timeline for reopening was provided. Today, the area where Marcus died remains off-limits to hunters and hikers alike. The truth of what Marcus encountered in his final hours may never be known, but his case serves as a chilling reminder that some mysteries are deliberately left unsolved and some evidence is too dangerous to be made public. On August 12, 2022, 31-year-old Marcus Chen pitched his tent in what he thought would be a peaceful spot along the Cascade River in North Cascades National Park, Washington. A software engineer from Seattle who had been camping solo for over 6 years, Marcus was seeking a weekend escape from the digital world that consumed his weekdays. What began as a routine 2-night camping trip to clear his head would become the most harrowing experience of his life and challenge everything he thought he knew about what lurked in the Pacific Northwest wilderness. Marcus Chen had always been drawn to solitude. Growing up in the suburbs of Seattle, he discovered early that nature provided the perfect antidote to his high-stress career in tech. Every few weeks, he would load his Honda Civic with camping gear and disappear into the mountains, often not speaking to another human being for days at a time. His friends at work thought he was crazy for camping alone, but Marcus found these solo adventures essential for his mental health and creativity. The North Cascades had become Marcus's favorite destination over the past 2 years. The rugged peaks, pristine alpine lakes, and dense old-growth forests offered the kind of raw wilderness experience that was becoming increasingly rare in the Pacific Northwest. He had explored dozens of trails throughout the region, always seeking more remote locations where he could truly disconnect from civilization. For this particular August weekend, Marcus had chosen a relatively unknown camping spot along the Cascade River, about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. He had discovered the location through an obscure hiking forum, where a fellow backpacker had mentioned a hidden meadow beside the river that offered spectacular views of the surrounding peaks. The description promised solitude and natural beauty, exactly what Marcus was seeking. Marcus arrived at the trailhead on Friday afternoon, August 12, 2022, after taking a half-day off work. The parking area was completely empty, which wasn't unusual for such a remote location on a weekday. He spent 30 minutes organizing his gear and checking his equipment, including a new lightweight tent he was eager to test and a high-end sleeping bag rated for temperatures down to 20 degrees. His pack weighed 38 pounds, loaded with 2 nights' worth of food, camping essentials, and a few luxury items like a portable camp chair and a paperback novel he'd been meaning to read. Marcus had learned from years of solo camping that comfort items were worth their weight when you were spending extended time alone in the wilderness. The hike to his chosen campsite took just over 2 hours, following an old logging road that gradually narrowed into a single-track trail. The path wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock, crossing several small creeks before opening into the meadow that had been described in the forum post. The location was even more beautiful than Marcus had imagined. A grassy clearing beside the rushing Cascade River, surrounded by towering peaks and ancient trees. Marcus spent the remainder of Friday afternoon setting up his camp and exploring the immediate area. He positioned his tent on a slight rise about 50 yards from the river, providing good drainage and a clear view of the surrounding forest. The spot felt perfect, secluded enough for complete privacy, but open enough to feel safe and comfortable. As evening approached, Marcus prepared a simple dinner on his camp stove while enjoying the peaceful sounds of the river and the gradual transition from daylight to dusk. He had always loved this time of day in the wilderness, when the forest seemed to come alive with subtle sounds and movements. The stress of his work week began to melt away as he settled into the rhythm of camp life. That first night passed without incident. Marcus slept soundly in his new tent, lulled by the constant sound of flowing water and the gentle rustling of wind through the trees. He woke refreshed on Saturday morning, looking forward to a full day of hiking and photography in the surrounding area. Saturday proved to be everything Marcus had hoped for. He spent the morning exploring upstream along the river, discovering hidden pools and small waterfalls that would have made perfect swimming holes if the water hadn't been so cold. The afternoon was devoted to hiking up a steep ridge that offered panoramic views of the North Cascades wilderness, stretching endlessly in all directions. As Marcus made his way back to camp in the late afternoon, he noticed something that hadn't been there when he left that morning. Near the edge of his campsite, pressed into a patch of soft earth beside the river, was what appeared to be a large footprint. The impression was roughly 14 inches long and significantly wider than any human foot, with clearly defined toe marks that suggested whatever made it had been walking upright. Marcus knelt beside the print, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. His first thought was that it might be a bear track, but the shape was all wrong. Bears left claw marks and had a completely different foot structure. This print looked disturbingly human-like, but far too large to have been made by any person. He spent several minutes examining the track, taking photos with his phone, and trying to think of rational explanations. The print was fresh, made sometime during the day while he was away from camp. The depth suggested something very heavy, probably weighing several hundred pounds. Most puzzling was the fact that there was only one clear print visible, as if whatever made it had been careful to step only in that one spot of soft ground. Marcus searched the surrounding area for additional tracks, but found nothing conclusive. There were some disturbed areas in the vegetation, and what might have been partial impressions in harder ground, but nothing as clear as the single print near his tent. The discovery left him feeling unsettled, though he tried to rationalize it as probably being from some large animal he wasn't familiar with. As darkness fell on Saturday night, Marcus found himself more alert than usual to the sounds around his campsite. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes seemed amplified, and he caught himself straining to listen for anything unusual. He had never been particularly nervous about camping alone, but the mysterious footprint had planted a seed of unease that he couldn't shake. Marcus eventually fell asleep around 11 p.m., but his rest was fitful and interrupted by strange dreams. He found himself waking periodically throughout the night, listening to the forest sounds and trying to determine if anything was out of place. Each time he woke, the wilderness seemed normal, just the usual symphony of insects, small animals, and wind through the trees. It was during one of these periods of light sleep, sometime around 3:30 a.m., that Marcus became aware of something moving near his tent. At first, he thought he might be dreaming, but the sounds were too distinct and too close to be imagination. Heavy footsteps were circling his campsite, moving with deliberate slowness as if trying not to make noise. Marcus lay perfectly still in his sleeping bag, his heart beginning to race as he realized this was no dream. Something large was walking around his tent, staying just far enough away to remain hidden in the darkness, but close enough that he could hear every footfall. The steps had a rhythm that suggested bipedal movement, not the four-legged gait of a bear or other large animal. For nearly 10 minutes, Marcus listened to the creature moving around his campsite. The footsteps would pause occasionally, as if whatever was out there was studying his tent or listening for signs of movement inside. During these pauses, Marcus could hear what sounded like heavy breathing, deep and rhythmic, like that of a large mammal. Then, without warning, the footsteps stopped directly beside his tent. Marcus could sense a massive presence just inches away from where he lay, separated only by the thin nylon wall of his shelter. His entire body was rigid with fear, and he found himself holding his breath as he tried to remain as still and quiet as possible. What happened next would haunt Marcus for months afterward. Something began to gently press against the side of his tent, as if a large hand was exploring the fabric. The pressure moved slowly along the wall, starting near his feet and gradually working its way toward his head. Marcus could feel the tent wall bowing inward under the weight of whatever was touching it. The exploration continued for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Marcus lay frozen, afraid that any movement might provoke whatever was outside his tent. The pressure was firm but not aggressive, more curious than threatening. It was as if something was trying to understand what the tent was and what might be inside it. Then came the moment that would change Marcus's life forever. As the pressure reached the area near his head, Marcus heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A low, rumbling vocalization that was unlike anything he had ever heard. It wasn't quite a growl, but it wasn't human either. The sound seemed to come from deep within a massive chest, resonating with intelligence and what could only be described as curiosity. Unable to contain his terror any longer, Marcus's body betrayed him with an involuntary gasp. The sound was barely audible, but it was enough. The pressure against his tent wall immediately stopped, and Marcus could sense the presence outside, shifting its attention directly toward where he lay. For several seconds, there was complete silence. Marcus could feel eyes watching him through the tent wall, studying him with an intelligence that was both alien and disturbingly familiar. The sensation was overwhelming, like being examined by something that understood exactly what he was, but remained completely unknown to him. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the encounter ended. Marcus heard the heavy footsteps moving away from his tent, but instead of the careful, stealthy movement from before, the creature now moved with purpose and surprising grace. Within moments, the sounds faded into the distance, leaving Marcus alone with his racing heart and the terrifying knowledge of what had just occurred. Marcus didn't sleep for the rest of the night. He lay in his sleeping bag until dawn, listening for any sign that the creature might return. Every sound in the forest seemed magnified, every shadow outside his tent a potential threat. When the first light of morning finally appeared, Marcus had never been so grateful to see the sun. His first instinct was to pack up immediately and hike out, but daylight brought a measure of courage and curiosity that overrode his fear. Marcus needed to understand what had happened, and he knew that leaving without investigating would haunt him forever. He spent the morning carefully examining the area around his tent, looking for any evidence of his nighttime visitor. What he found exceeded his worst fears and wildest expectations. The ground around his campsite was covered with tracks, dozens of clear footprints that told the story of his encounter in disturbing detail. The prints showed that something large and bipedal had indeed circled his tent multiple times, approaching from different angles as if studying the best way to investigate. The clearest prints were near where Marcus had felt the pressure against his tent wall. These impressions showed remarkable detail: individual toe marks, what appeared to be dermal ridges, and pressure patterns that indicated a creature of immense weight and size. Most unsettling was the depth and clarity of the prints, which suggested that whatever made them had been moving very slowly and deliberately. Marcus spent over an hour documenting the tracks with his phone camera, taking measurements and trying to create a record of what he had experienced. The prints varied in size, but averaged around 15 inches in length and 7 inches in width. The stride length suggested something much taller than a human, but walking upright like one. As he studied the evidence, Marcus began to realize the full implications of what had occurred. This wasn't a case of mistaken identity or an overactive imagination. Something unknown and intelligent had visited his campsite, examined his tent, and demonstrated a level of curiosity and restraint that was both fascinating and terrifying. The decision to stay for his planned second night was one of the most difficult Marcus had ever made. Every rational part of his mind screamed at him to pack up and leave immediately, but his curiosity and a strange sense that he had been chosen for this experience kept him rooted to the spot. He spent Sunday hiking in the surrounding area, but his mind kept returning to the events of the previous night and the possibility that they might be repeated. As evening approached on Sunday, Marcus found himself both dreading and anticipating what might happen. He prepared for bed with a mixture of fear and excitement, wondering if his mysterious visitor would return. He had positioned his phone within easy reach, hoping to capture audio or video evidence if another encounter occurred. Sunday night passed without incident, much to Marcus's relief and slight disappointment. He slept better than he had expected, though he remained alert to every sound throughout the night. When morning came, he found no new tracks around his campsite, suggesting that whatever had visited him on Saturday night had moved on or lost interest. Marcus packed up his camp on Monday morning with mixed emotions. Part of him was relieved to be leaving the site of such a terrifying experience, but another part felt like he was walking away from the most significant event of his life. The drive back to Seattle gave him time to process what had happened and decide what to do with his incredible story. His first instinct was to keep the experience to himself. Marcus knew that telling people about his encounter would likely result in skepticism, ridicule, or worse. His career in tech required a reputation for rational thinking and logical problem-solving. Claiming to have been visited by Bigfoot would not enhance his professional standing, but the evidence was too compelling to ignore. Marcus had dozens of clear photographs of the footprints, and the memory of his encounter was burned into his consciousness with perfect clarity. He began researching similar experiences online, discovering a vast community of people who had reported comparable encounters throughout the Pacific Northwest. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a wildlife biologist at the University of Washington who had been quietly studying Bigfoot reports for over a decade, became Marcus's first contact in the scientific community. She had seen countless hoaxes and misidentifications, but Marcus's photographs and detailed account impressed her with their consistency and credibility. Dr. Mitchell explained that Marcus's experience fit a pattern she had been documenting for years. Encounters that suggested these creatures were not only real, but possessed a level of intelligence and curiosity that mainstream science was reluctant to acknowledge. The gentle, exploratory nature of Marcus's encounter was particularly significant, as it suggested behavior that was investigative rather than aggressive. The analysis of Marcus's footprint photographs revealed details that would be nearly impossible to fabricate. The print showed anatomical features consistent with a large bipedal primate, including pressure patterns that indicated how weight was distributed during walking. Most compelling were the dermal ridges visible in several of the clearest prints, details that would require sophisticated knowledge of primate anatomy to fake convincingly. Marcus's story began to spread through the cryptozoology community, attracting attention from researchers around the world. His account was notable not just for the physical evidence he had collected, but for the intimate nature of his encounter. Most Bigfoot sightings involve brief glimpses of creatures at a distance. Marcus had experienced prolonged close contact that provided unprecedented insights into the behavior of these mysterious beings. The psychological impact of his experience was profound. Marcus found himself changed by his encounter, more aware of the mysteries that still existed in the natural world, and less certain about the boundaries between the known and unknown. His weekend camping trips took on new meaning as he searched for additional evidence and hoped for another encounter with the creature that had visited his tent. 6 months after his original experience, Marcus returned to the same campsite, hoping to find additional evidence or perhaps encounter his mysterious visitor again. The location looked exactly as he remembered, but despite spending 3 nights in the same spot, nothing unusual occurred. The creature, whatever it was, had moved on or chosen not to reveal itself again. Marcus's encounter has become one of the most well-documented and credible Bigfoot reports in recent years. His background in technology, the quality of his photographic evidence, and the detailed nature of his account have convinced many researchers that he experienced something genuinely extraordinary. The gentle, curious behavior he described has added new dimensions to our understanding of how these creatures might interact with humans. The creature that visited Marcus's tent on that August night in 2022 remains as mysterious as ever. But the brief contact between human and unknown being has provided a glimpse into a hidden world that exists parallel to our own, reminding us that even in our modern age of scientific advancement, the wilderness still holds secrets that challenge our understanding of what's possible. Marcus continues to camp in the North Cascades, always hoping for another encounter, but never again experiencing anything like that terrifying and wonderful night when something unknown chose to investigate his tent. His story serves as a reminder that sometimes the most profound experiences come not from seeking them out, but from remaining open to the extraordinary encounters that await those brave enough to venture alone into the wild places where mystery still lives. The truth about what pressed against Marcus's tent wall that night may never be fully understood, but his experience has opened new avenues of research and added to the growing body of evidence that suggests we are not alone in the wilderness. Sometimes, in the deepest forests of the Pacific Northwest, we are the ones being watched, studied, and perhaps even protected by intelligences that remain just beyond our understanding. The months following Marcus's encounter brought unexpected changes to his life that extended far beyond his camping habits. His story, initially shared only with Dr. Mitchell and a small circle of researchers, began to attract attention from documentary filmmakers, podcasters, and journalists specializing in unexplained phenomena. Marcus found himself reluctantly thrust into a spotlight he had never sought, becoming a reluctant spokesperson for an experience he was still trying to fully understand. The first major media attention came from a popular paranormal podcast called Wilderness Mysteries, whose host had heard about Marcus's encounter through the Cryptozoology Research Network. The 3-hour interview, recorded in Marcus's Seattle apartment, became one of the show's most downloaded episodes. Marcus's calm, technical approach to describing his experience, treating it like a software problem to be analyzed and understood, resonated with listeners who were tired of sensationalized Bigfoot stories. The podcast's success led to more interview requests, and Marcus found himself walking a careful line between sharing his story and maintaining his privacy. His colleagues at the tech company where he worked began to take notice, though most were surprisingly supportive. The tech industry, it turned out, was full of people who spent their weekends hiking in the same wilderness areas where Marcus had his encounter. Dr. Mitchell introduced Marcus to a network of researchers who had been quietly studying similar phenomena for decades. This group, calling themselves the Pacific Northwest Primate Research Collective, included wildlife biologists, anthropologists, and even a few park rangers who had witnessed unexplained encounters during their careers. Marcus discovered that his experience, while extraordinary, was part of a larger pattern of interactions that suggested these creatures had been observing and occasionally making contact with humans for generations. The collective had been documenting what they called investigative encounters, incidents where the creatures seemed to be studying human behavior rather than simply avoiding contact. Marcus's tent investigation fit perfectly into this category, along with dozens of other reports from campers, hikers, and hunters who had experienced similar curious but non-threatening interactions. One particularly intriguing case involved a family camping near Mount Rainier, whose tent had been gently explored in almost exactly the same manner as Marcus's experience. The father, a geology professor, had remained silent about the encounter for over a decade before connecting with the research collective. His detailed notes and sketches from the incident showed remarkable similarities to Marcus's account, including the same pattern of circling behavior and gentle tactile investigation. As Marcus delved deeper into the research, he began to understand that his encounter might represent something more significant than a simple wildlife sighting. The evidence suggested that these creatures possessed not only intelligence, but also a sophisticated understanding of human behavior and technology. The fact that they could approach campsites undetected, investigate human artifacts without causing damage, and retreat without leaving obvious traces indicated a level of strategic thinking that challenged conventional assumptions about unknown primates. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. Marcus found himself questioning fundamental assumptions about intelligence, consciousness, and humanity's place in the natural world. His work in artificial intelligence took on new meaning as he considered the possibility that genuine non-human intelligence might already exist in the forests he loved to explore. His camping trips became more purposeful and scientific. Marcus began carrying additional equipment, motion-activated cameras, audio recording devices, and even environmental sensors that could detect changes in electromagnetic fields or infrasound that might indicate the presence of large animals. He developed protocols for documenting any unusual findings and shared his methods with other researchers in the collective. The scientific approach yielded surprising results. Over the course of 18 months following his original encounter, Marcus collected dozens of anomalous recordings, photographs, and environmental readings from various camping locations throughout the North Cascades. While none provided the definitive proof that would convince mainstream science, the accumulated evidence painted a picture of ongoing activity in areas where these creatures had been reported. Most intriguing were the audio recordings. Marcus's sensitive equipment captured vocalizations that didn't match any known wildlife in the region, complex calls that seemed to carry information across long distances. Analysis by acoustic experts revealed harmonic structures and frequency patterns that suggested intentional communication rather than random animal sounds. The research also revealed disturbing patterns in official incident reports. Park Service records, when examined carefully, showed clusters of unusual wildlife encounters and unexplained disturbances in areas where the collective had documented creature activity. Most of these reports had been filed away without investigation, dismissed as misidentifications or hoaxes by officials who lacked the context to understand their significance. Marcus's technical background proved invaluable in analyzing this data. He developed algorithms to identify patterns in sighting reports, correlating them with environmental factors like weather, moon phases, and seasonal changes. The results suggested that these encounters followed predictable patterns, occurring most frequently during specific times of year and under particular atmospheric conditions. The work began to consume more of Marcus's time and energy. He took extended leave from his job to focus on the research, using his savings to fund equipment purchases and travel to remote locations. His friends and family worried about his obsession, but Marcus felt driven by a sense of purpose he had never experienced in his corporate career. The breakthrough came during a solo camping trip to a remote valley in the North Cascades, nearly 2 years after his original encounter. Marcus had been monitoring the area for months, documenting unusual activity, and gradually building what he believed was a comprehensive picture of creature movement patterns in the region. On the second night of his trip, Marcus was awakened by familiar sounds, the same careful footsteps he remembered from his first encounter. This time, however, he was prepared. His cameras were positioned strategically around his campsite, and he had practiced remaining motionless during simulated encounters. The creature that approached his tent that night seemed different from his first visitor. Smaller, perhaps younger, but displaying the same curious behavior. Marcus lay perfectly still as it circled his campsite, occasionally pausing to investigate his equipment. The motion-activated cameras captured remarkable footage of a bipedal figure moving with fluid grace through the forest, its proportions clearly non-human, but its behavior unmistakably intelligent. The encounter lasted nearly an hour, during which Marcus experienced the same mixture of terror and wonder that had defined his first experience. When the creature finally departed, it left behind clear evidence of its visit: footprints, disturbed vegetation, and most remarkably, what appeared to be a deliberate arrangement of stones near Marcus's tent. The stone arrangement was unlike anything Marcus had seen before. 7 rocks of varying sizes had been placed in a precise pattern that seemed too intentional to be coincidental. Dr. Mitchell and other researchers were fascinated by this development, as it suggested not only intelligence, but also a desire to communicate or leave some kind of message. Analysis of the footage from that night provided the clearest images of these creatures ever captured. The video showed anatomical details that confirmed their primate nature while highlighting features that didn't match any known species. Most significantly, the creature's behavior demonstrated problem-solving abilities and environmental awareness that indicated a level of intelligence comparable to early hominids. Marcus's second encounter marked a turning point in the research collective's work. The quality of evidence he had gathered, combined with similar findings from other researchers, began to attract attention from mainstream scientists who had previously dismissed Bigfoot research as pseudoscience. A small but growing number of primatologists, anthropologists, and wildlife biologists began to acknowledge that the accumulated evidence deserved serious scientific investigation. The implications of this shift were profound. If these creatures were real, they represented either an unknown species of primate or possibly a surviving population of archaic hominids that had adapted to life in North America's most remote wilderness areas. Either possibility would revolutionize our understanding of primate evolution and human prehistory. Marcus's journey from skeptical camper to dedicated researcher illustrates how a single extraordinary experience can reshape an entire life. His encounters have contributed to a growing body of evidence that suggests the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest harbors secrets that challenge our most basic assumptions about the natural world. The creatures that visited Marcus's tent remain as mysterious as ever, but their brief interactions with one curious human have opened new avenues of scientific inquiry and reminded us that even in our age of satellite imagery and GPS tracking, the wild places of our world still hold wonders that await discovery. On September 15, 2018, search teams found Cecilia Mangrove's empty campsite in Olympic National Forest, Washington. She was a scientist who had left 3 days earlier, but her broken phone and camera gear hinted she'd encountered something unusual in the wilderness, sparking the most mysterious disappearance in the Pacific Northwest.
It's an elusive creature.
Cecilia, a 29-year-old environmental scientist and avid hiker from Portland, Oregon, set out on September 11, 2018. She packed her gear for what should have been a routine 3-day expedition. The destination was Whisper Creek Trail in Olympic National Forest, a place so isolated that park rangers joked it saw more bears than hikers. But that's exactly what made it perfect for Cecilia's research on old-growth forest recovery. What she didn't realize was just how far from civilization she was traveling, or that this remote stretch of forest, rarely visited by humans, might be hiding something extraordinary, something out of legend, something the locals whispered about but few had ever seen, and something they called Bigfoot. What her family didn't know was that Cecilia had spent that day methodically documenting the forest. Between 6 and 8 p.m. on September 11th, she took over 100 photos, far more than her usual evening routine. As an environmental scientist studying forest recovery, she typically photographed tree formations and growth patterns. But that evening was different. Her camera focused on areas where vegetation grew unusually thick and trees had strange, irregular shapes. Her research journal, found later at the campsite, revealed why. Detailed notes described strange wildlife signs and unusual disturbances in the forest floor. The final entry, dated September 11th at 10:30 p.m., described something large that had recently moved through the area. Broken branches 8 feet high and unusual track marks near the creek. She planned to investigate further the next day. The weather stayed perfect throughout the night, with clear skies and calm winds. According to weather data, conditions were ideal for the wildlife watching and photography work that Cecilia had planned for the next day. Nothing in the weather suggested any reason to worry about her safety or the success of her trip. September 12, 2018, started like any other day for people waiting to hear from Cecilia Mangrove. According to the detailed plan she had submitted to both her employer and the Olympic National Forest Ranger Station, she was supposed to pack up camp early and hike the remaining 4 miles to Summit Lake, where she planned to set up her main research base. No one expected to hear from her during this day, since the deeper wilderness areas of Whisper Creek Trail had no cell phone coverage. Cecilia had noted this in her planning documents and had also informed both her brother Marcus and her boss. Her satellite communication device, a Garmin InReach Explorer that she carried on all solo trips, was set to send automatic location signals every 4 hours during daylight. The device sent its final signal at 6:18 a.m. on September 12th, showing her position at the campsite where she had spent the night. After that time, the device went completely silent. This was unusual, but not immediately scary, since satellite coverage could be spotty in the thick forest of the Olympic Peninsula. September 13th was the day Cecilia was supposed to come back. Her plan said she would pack up camp at Summit Lake by 8 a.m. and hike back to the trailhead, getting there by 4 p.m. Marcus Mangrove had arranged to meet her for dinner in Portland that evening, something they always did after each of her major solo trips. When 6 p.m. came and went without a word from his sister, Marcus started calling her cell phone. All calls went straight to voicemail. At first, Marcus wasn't too worried. Cecilia had been late coming back from hikes before, usually because she found something interesting to research, or the trail was harder than expected. She was careful about safety, but also passionate about her work, and he knew she might stay longer if she discovered something scientifically important. However, as the evening went on and his calls kept going unanswered, he started to worry more. By 10 p.m. on September 13th, Marcus had left 12 voicemails and sent many text messages. He also checked Cecilia's Instagram account, hoping to see a post explaining why she was late, but her last update was still the campfire photo from September 11th. This was very unusual. Cecilia usually posted daily during her trips, and she had never gone more than 24 hours without some form of communication during a solo hike. September 14th brought more worry. Cecilia was scheduled for a 9 a.m. conference call with her research team at work, something she had never missed. When she didn't join the call, her supervisor, Dr. Jennifer Walsh, immediately contacted Marcus. By noon, both Marcus and Dr. Walsh had driven to the Whisper Creek trailhead, where they found Cecilia's Honda CR-V exactly where she had parked it 3 days earlier. The car was locked and undisturbed. Her spare key, which she always hid in a magnetic case under the rear bumper, was still there. Inside the car, they found her purse, wallet, and a detailed backup copy of her research notes, things she never would have left behind if she had returned safely. Most concerning was finding her emergency contact card on the dashboard, which listed Marcus's phone number and included specific instructions about when to contact authorities if she failed to return. At 2:47 p.m. on September 14th, Marcus called the Olympic National Forest Ranger Station to report his sister missing. Ranger Elena Vasquez, who had processed Cecilia's backcountry permit, immediately understood how serious the situation was. Cecilia was known to park staff as an experienced and reliable hiker who always followed safety rules. Her failure to return as scheduled was completely unlike her. The first response was quick but limited. 2 park rangers hiked the first 3 miles of Whisper Creek Trail that afternoon, calling Cecilia's name and looking for any signs of her. They found nothing unusual on the main trail and returned to organize a bigger search effort for the next day. September 15th marked the beginning of the official search and rescue operation. At dawn, a team of 12 searchers, including park rangers, volunteer search and rescue people, and a dog unit, entered the Whisper Creek Trail. The search team had GPS devices, emergency medical supplies, and communication equipment to coordinate their efforts across the challenging terrain. The most important breakthrough in Cecilia Mangrove's disappearance came from finding her iPhone 8, discovered by search and rescue teams 50 yards downstream from her abandoned campsite. The device was lodged partly underwater in Whisper Creek, trapped between 2 rocks in shallow water. Despite significant water damage and a badly cracked screen, crime lab technicians were able to recover much of the phone's data, though some files were partially corrupted. What they could reconstruct revealed a chilling sequence of events that appeared to occur in the early morning hours of September 12, 2018. According to the phone's metadata, Cecilia's final photo sequence began at exactly 6:23 a.m. The first image was deceptively ordinary, a golden sunrise streaming through the trees, captured from inside her tent. The composition suggested she had woken naturally, starting her day with routine environmental documentation, photographing the forest floor and light patterns. The photo was calm, almost serene, masking the ominous events about to unfold. 2 minutes later, at 6:25 a.m., the second photo marked a dramatic shift. Cecilia had intentionally focused on a massive footprint pressed deep into the muddy ground beside Whisper Creek. Analysis revealed the print measured approximately 18.5 inches long and 7.2 inches wide, with clearly defined toe impressions and a skin-like texture along the pads. The depth suggested the creature weighed far more than any known wildlife in the Olympic Peninsula. It was unlike a bear, elk, or human, and the freshness of the imprint suggested it had been made while she slept in her tent just yards away. At 6:28 a.m., Cecilia's third photo captured the tree line about 30 yards from her campsite. At first glance, it seemed like a routine forest shot, but digital enhancement revealed a dark, upright silhouette, partially hidden among the evergreen branches. The figure appeared unusually tall, roughly 8 feet, and moved in a way that didn't match any known animal in the region. Judging by the angle and framing, Cecilia seemed to have paused briefly, adjusting her camera to capture the figure without drawing attention. Leaves rustled beneath it, branches snapped softly, and a shadow swept across the clearing. Even through her scientific lens, the scene was extraordinary, unsettling, and completely unexpected. The fourth photo, taken at 6:31 a.m., showed Cecilia's face, wide-eyed and tense, her mouth slightly open as if holding her breath. Reflections in her eyes hinted at movement in the tree line, though the background remained blurry. The image captured both her terror and the realization that she was witnessing something extraordinary, something unlike any known wildlife. At 6:34 a.m., Cecilia's phone recorded a 47-second audio clip that sent chills through forensic analysts. Her whispering voice, punctuated by shallow, rapid breaths, indicated panic but also intentional documentation. Overlapping her voice were the sounds of footsteps on leaves, snapping twigs, and a low, guttural noise. The tonal quality of the sound was unlike any known mammal or bird call in the region. Midway through the clip, Cecilia's voice surged, narrating rapidly and carefully, noting movement, proximity, and behaviors of whatever she had encountered. Then, abruptly, a loud crack, a tree branch breaking under massive weight, ended the recording, followed by static. The phone likely dropped or was damaged in the scramble that followed. Between 6:25 and 6:36 a.m., her camera, audio and drafts, revealed an escalating encounter. She typed 2 urgent messages she never sent. One to her brother, Marcus, instructing him to check the photos if anything happened, and one to her supervisor, explaining she had discovered something extraordinary that could revolutionize her ecological reports. The unsent messages implied that Cecilia's observation window had been brief, minutes, possibly seconds, before her situation became dire. During the early part of this period, her recordings and notes captured a mix of careful scientific observation and growing alarm. Every detail, the massive footprint, the distant silhouette in the tree line, and the unusual guttural sounds, was documented meticulously, highlighting her instinct to record what she was witnessing even as the encounter intensified. The GPS data from her phone painted a frantic picture. After the 6:31 a.m. photo, the device tracked rapid movement away from the campsite, approximately 200 yards in under 3 minutes. Her path was erratic, sudden stops, abrupt changes in direction, and repeated backtracking, suggesting she was moving to both observe and evade. Disturbed brush and broken branches along the route supported the theory that a large creature had been moving near her, if not following her. Enhancing the audio from the camera, experts noted a sequence of steps heavier than a human's, but lighter than a large bear, interspersed with the guttural noises. The sound suggested deliberate observation. The creature was close enough to leave detailed prints, but not immediately visible to her. Cecilia's whispers reveal her scientific instincts kicking in. She notes movement, branch position, and sound direction, documenting the phenomenon while experiencing primal fear. By 6:36 a.m., the situation escalated. Cecilia's satellite communicator attempted to send an SOS via her Garmin InReach Explorer. Only a fragmented message with GPS coordinates was transmitted before the device failed, likely due to damage or environmental interference. This last transmission, combined with the GPS, camera, and audio data, indicated that Cecilia encountered a massive, intelligent, and mobile presence in the forest, one she had been observing intentionally but could not fully escape or communicate about. The investigation into Cecilia Mangrove's disappearance suggests she may not have been entirely alone in the Whisper Creek area during her final expedition. Jake Morrison, a 34-year-old software developer from Tacoma, had been camping about 2 miles north of Cecilia's location on the night of September 11–12, 2018. An experienced backpacker with over 15 years of wilderness experience, Morrison shared a troubling account that aligns loosely with the timeline from Cecilia's digital evidence, hinting that someone, or something, may have been in the area at the same time. Morrison told investigators he woke at 6:30 a.m. on September 12th to a chilling 10-second howl from Whisper Creek, unlike anything he'd heard in his years outdoors. When he returned from checking the area, his campsite was unnervingly tidy, yet altered. Water bottles neatly by the fire ring, boots moved and aligned. Nothing was stolen or damaged, leaving him convinced it was deliberate, too organized to be wildlife mischief. Park Ranger Elena Vasquez, who had worked in Olympic National Forest for 15 years, provided crucial context about the unusual evidence found at Cecilia's campsite. In her decade and a half of investigating wildlife encounters and missing person cases, she said the prints were unlike anything she had documented before. They were larger than bear tracks, wrong shape for humans, and the stride length was unusually long, suggesting something that walked upright. Vasquez's testimony revealed a pattern of unusual incidents in the Whisper Creek area that had been quietly logged but not widely publicized. Over the previous 5 years, 3 separate hikers had reported disturbing encounters in the same region where Cecilia disappeared. Park officials had categorized these as unexplained incidents, but chose not to release them broadly, concerned it might discourage visitors or fuel speculation about the forest. The first incident occurred in September 2014, when a married couple hiked a remote stretch of the Whisper Creek Trail and reported feeling as though they were being followed. For over 2 miles, they heard snapping branches and low, indistinct noises that seemed to come from all around. Shadows shifted at the edges of their vision, disappearing whenever they tried to focus directly on them. By the time they reached the trailhead, they were shaken, convinced that something unusually large had been moving through the forest near them. The second incident occurred in October 2016, when a solo hiker reported several blurry photographs showing a large, upright figure moving among the dense evergreens. The images were grainy, but the shape appeared unusually tall, with movements that seemed deliberate and disturbingly human-like. The hiker also recalled hearing heavy footfalls nearby, and low, resonant sounds that seemed to come from different directions within the forest, though it was impossible to pinpoint their source. The third encounter occurred just 8 months before Cecilia's disappearance. A group of college students camping in the area awoke to find their site disturbed, in a way reminiscent of Jake Morrison's later report. Tents were partially torn, supplies had been moved, and unusually large footprints, estimated at around 6 feet in length, were pressed into the soft ground surrounding the camp. Initially, they assumed a bear had wandered through, but the size and spacing of the prints suggested deliberate movement. Some of the students reported catching brief glimpses of a dark, hulking figure at the edge of the tree line, disappearing whenever they looked directly. Perhaps the most significant testimony came from Thomas Clearwater, a 73-year-old Quinault elder, explained to investigators that his people had always considered the Whisper Creek area both sacred and dangerous. According to tribal stories, the forest doesn't take kindly to those who try to take more than they should. Tribal records passed down through generations documented 7 unexplained disappearances in that area over the past century, with most happening in early fall when the forest is said to be most protective. In the weeks following Cecilia Mangrove's disappearance, investigators developed 4 main theories to explain what happened during her final hours in the Olympic wilderness. Each theory was carefully examined against the available evidence, but none of the conventional explanations could adequately account for all the disturbing details recovered from the scene. Investigators looked at several possible explanations for what happened to Cecilia. At first, a wildlife attack seemed most likely. The Olympic Peninsula has black bears and mountain lions that can attack people. Claw marks on her tent and the disturbed campsite suggested a large predator had been there. But this idea fell apart when they looked closer. There was no blood at the scene, despite signs of violence. Even stranger, Cecilia's belongings were carefully arranged, her boots placed neatly together, her camera equipment secured in waterproof bags, and her phone positioned in the creek rather than scattered around. Large predators don't organize things this way. Some thought a human predator might have followed Cecilia's social media posts and tracked her down. This would explain why her belongings were deliberately arranged instead of randomly destroyed. But the massive 18-inch footprints around the campsite were way too big for any human. Audio specialists said the recorded sounds didn't match anything humans or known wildlife could make. Plus, the remote location and difficult terrain made it unlikely a stalker could reach the area without leaving their own evidence trail. Another possibility was that Cecilia had an accident. Maybe she fell into Whisper Creek, got hypothermia, or injured, and became confused before dying from exposure. Finding her phone in the water seemed to support this idea at first. But her photos and audio recordings clearly showed she was alert and actively documenting something extraordinary in her final moments. Her pictures were well composed and focused, not the confused work of someone suffering from injury or exposure. Despite searching over 50 square miles, no trace of her body was ever found, though investigators noted that dense terrain can hide remains for years. The most controversial explanation for Cecilia Mangrove's disappearance was a Bigfoot encounter. The evidence was striking. Massive footprints with unusual ridge-like textures, audio recordings of unidentified sounds, coarse hair samples that defied DNA analysis, and a historical pattern of similar sightings in the region. Cecilia's final photos and audio suggested she had come face-to-face with something that both terrified and fascinated her, something she deemed important enough to document despite the risk. Her behavior mirrored reports from other Pacific Northwest Bigfoot encounters, where witnesses often describe simultaneous fear and scientific curiosity. The convergence of physical evidence, witness accounts, and regional precedent made the cryptid theory difficult to dismiss. Skeptics argued that extraordinary claims require extraordinary proof, but supporters pointed to Cecilia's meticulous documentation as exactly that proof that could have reshaped understanding of the phenomenon had she survived to share it. Analysis of Cecilia's phone, GPS, photos, and audio revealed a clear sequence of events. First, the massive footprint, then a distant silhouette in the tree line, followed by direct auditory interaction, and finally her frantic movements as captured by GPS. Each stage escalated both tension and danger for Cecilia and for investigators reconstructing the encounter. The combination of her careful scientific documentation and the terrifying reality of an unseen, massive presence makes this one of the most compelling modern Bigfoot cases on record. The Olympic Peninsula has long been a hotspot for cryptid activity, with more than 200 documented Bigfoot sightings since the 1950s. What made Cecilia's case particularly significant was how her findings fit into this larger pattern, adding weight to a decades-long series of mysterious encounters. Environmental factors further strengthened the plausibility of her observations. Whisper Creek Trail is remote, with dense undergrowth, fallen logs, and uneven terrain. Sounds carry differently in thick forests, and shadows can conceal movement. For a trained environmental scientist like Cecilia, the combination of unusual footprints, auditory anomalies, and visual evidence made the encounter strikingly credible. In the 2 years before Cecilia's disappearance, the Olympic National Forest received 12 reports of unusual encounters within a 20-mile radius of Whisper Creek. Witnesses described consistent signs, Massive footprints, strange sounds, a feeling of being watched, and behavior suggesting intelligence beyond normal wildlife. Park officials largely kept these reports confidential to prevent panic and protect tourism. But Cecilia's case brought them into the public record. What investigators discovered about Cecilia's preparation for the trip added another layer to the mystery. Her browser history revealed extensive research into local cryptid reports in the weeks leading up to her expedition. As part of her work on old-growth forest recovery, Cecilia had been studying the effects of wildlife on forest ecosystems, and she noted that many cryptid reports mentioned undisturbed areas and unusual animal activity. She had visited forums dedicated to Bigfoot Encounters, downloaded academic papers about primate behavior, and bookmarked articles specifically about the Olympic Peninsula's history of unexplained sightings. This wasn't casual curiosity. Cecilia appeared to be approaching the search methodically, using her ecological research as a framework for documenting and potentially verifying an extraordinary presence. Dr. Sarah Marvis, a primatologist at the University of Washington, provided crucial expert analysis of the audio evidence recovered from Cecilia's phone. After studying the 47-second recording, Dr. Marvis concluded that the sounds contained acoustic properties unlike any known North American wildlife. The sounds demonstrated a vocal range and resonance that exceeded human capabilities while showing structured patterns that suggested intelligence and intentional communication. The physical evidence was equally compelling. Plaster casts of the footprints around Cecilia's campsite showed detailed textures along the pads and toes, suggesting they were made by a living creature rather than a carved hoax. The stride length, over 6 feet, indicated bipedal movement by a creature significantly larger than any known primate species. Perhaps most intriguing was the behavioral evidence. The careful arrangement of Cecilia's belongings, the organized disturbance of Jake Morrison's campsite, and the historical pattern of similar encounters suggested intelligence and possibly even curiosity about human activities. This aligned with indigenous accounts of forest guardians who observed and interacted with humans in complex ways. The Olympic Peninsula's dense forests, abundant wildlife, and minimal human traffic provide ideal conditions for a large, elusive species to remain hidden. What set Cecilia's case apart was her meticulous documentation and scientific expertise. She captured fleeting evidence that had eluded countless others: subtle movements in the shadows, sounds with unusual patterns, and hints of an unseen observer. The tragedy was that her encounter ended with her disappearance, leaving these discoveries as clues without resolution. Even so, her findings remain controversial. In the scientific community and among the public, many dismiss the case as folklore or suggest Cecilia may have fabricated the clues. Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest have long been part of local legend, and skeptics argue that extraordinary claims require far more verifiable proof. Yet whispers persist. Hikers near Whisper Creek occasionally discover strange footprints, fresh disturbances, or fleeting glimpses of dark shapes at the edge of vision. Some report hearing low, resonant calls in the early morning mist, eerily similar to those captured on Cecilia's recordings. The forest seems to guard its secrets carefully, revealing just enough to intrigue the curious and unsettle the skeptical. Her disappearance remains one of the most puzzling unsolved cases in Pacific Northwest history. The official investigation, led by the Olympic National Forest Service and Washington State Police, covered over 50 square miles during an intensive 6-day search operation. Despite using helicopters, dog units, and dozens of experienced searchers, no trace of Cecilia's body was ever recovered. The case officially remains classified as a missing person investigation, though most investigators privately acknowledge that Cecilia is presumed dead. Her disappearance prompted significant changes in backcountry safety protocols, with park authorities now strongly recommending GPS tracking devices for solo hikers and requiring communication gear for researchers operating under official permits. Marcus has never stopped searching for his sister. he established a foundation dedicated to wilderness safety, which provides emergency communication equipment to researchers and maintains a database of unexplained wilderness encounters. Marcus continues to organize annual search expeditions, though he admits his focus has shifted from finding Cecilia to understanding what happened to her. 2 weeks after her disappearance, hiker David Chen discovered a cedar tree carving 3 miles deeper into the wilderness than any official search had reached. It showed the initials CM, followed by the words, "They're real," and "Tell the world," with an arrow pointing farther into the forest. Handwriting analysis strongly suggested Cecilia carved it, prompting an additional search in the surrounding area. No further evidence was ever recovered. This discovery raised more questions than it answered. Had Cecilia followed something into the forest? Was she trying to gather more evidence? Or had she been taken somewhere beyond the reach of conventional search efforts? The ultimate question remains. Did Cecilia Mangrove make the greatest scientific discovery of the 21st century, only to pay the ultimate price for her curiosity? Her case continues to inspire researchers, cryptozoologists, and adventurers who believe that somewhere in the vast Olympic wilderness, the truth about her final days is still waiting to be discovered. The summer heat of July 2018 hung heavy over the eastern Montana plains, where a remote drilling operation hummed through the night. Miles from the nearest town, the industrial site stood like an alien outpost against the endless grassland. Bill Gray had supervised night shifts for over 15 years, but something about this particular site felt different from the moment they broke ground. The veteran supervisor couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched from beyond the reach of their floodlights. His crew consisted of 3 reliable men, Dave Mando and Miguel Mano, both experienced drill operators who knew their equipment inside and out, and Frank Kitagawa, a security guard whose job was to monitor the perimeter and ensure no unauthorized personnel entered the work zone. According to Bill, the first sign of trouble came on July 17th, when an otherworldly howl echoed across the plains during the midnight hour. The sound was unlike anything the crew had heard before, deeper than a coyote's call, more guttural than a wolf's howl, and carrying an almost human quality that sent chills down their spines. Frank immediately grabbed his flashlight and swept the darkness beyond the fence line, but found nothing except swaying grass and shadows. Bill suggested it was probably just some coyotes fighting over a kill, though his voice lacked conviction. The crew had all worked in remote locations before, and they knew the sounds of prairie wildlife. This was something else entirely. Over the next several nights, the howls became a regular occurrence, always between midnight and 3 in the morning. More disturbing was how the sound seemed to be getting closer to the drilling pad with each passing night. What started as distant calls from perhaps a mile away gradually moved to within a few hundred yards of their operation. The crew found themselves constantly glancing toward the darkness, their nerves fraying with each shift. The industrial lighting that had once provided comfort now seemed inadequate, creating stark contrasts between the harshly illuminated work area and the impenetrable blackness beyond. The drilling equipment's constant noise, which usually provided a comforting backdrop of familiar sounds, now seemed to mask potential threats approaching from the prairie. Dave Mando was the first to capture concrete evidence of their mysterious visitor. On the night of July 23rd, he was returning from a supply run to town when his vehicle's dash cam recorded something extraordinary. As his headlights swept across a small rise about 200 yards from the drilling pad, 2 glowing eyes reflected back at him from the darkness. But these weren't the typical green or yellow reflections of deer or cattle. These eyes glowed with an amber intensity and were positioned far too high off the ground. When Dave reviewed the footage the next morning, the crew gathered around his laptop in stunned silence. The eyes appeared to be approximately 7 feet off the ground, far higher than any known wildlife in the region. More unsettling was their spacing. They were set wide apart, suggesting a creature with a massive skull. The reflection lasted only a few seconds before whatever was out there moved away from the headlight beam. but the image was burned into their memories. Miguel suggested it could be a moose. Frank shook his head and replied that moose didn't live out there, and he'd never seen moose eyes glow like that. The crew's unease deepened when they discovered evidence of sabotage the following morning. One of the fuel lines feeding the main generator had been ripped open during the night, causing a significant diesel spill. But this wasn't the clean cut of a knife or saw. The heavy rubber hose had been torn apart with tremendous force, leaving jagged edges that suggested incredible strength. Bill immediately contacted the drilling company's security department, and within 2 days, additional cameras were installed around the perimeter of the operation. The new surveillance system included infrared capabilities and motion sensors, creating a comprehensive monitoring network that should have captured any intruder, human or otherwise. The enhanced security measures paid off on July 28th, when the cameras recorded their most compelling evidence yet. At exactly 2:13 a.m., motion sensors triggered the recording system as a large, dark figure crossed the service road approximately 100 yards from the drilling pad. The creature moved with a fluid, bipedal gait that was distinctly non-human, yet clearly intelligent and purposeful. Using a parked maintenance truck as a scale reference, the crew estimated the creature's height at over 6 feet, with shoulders that appeared level with the truck's cab. The figure was covered in dark hair or fur and moved with surprising speed across the illuminated area before disappearing into the darkness on the far side of the road. The entire sequence lasted less than 10 seconds, but it provided undeniable proof that something large and unknown was stalking their operation. Despite the compelling video evidence, the response from wildlife officials was dismissive and frustrating. According to authorities, a state biologist examined the footage and quickly concluded that the crew had simply recorded a large moose that had wandered onto the site. Her official report stated that the lighting conditions and camera angle had created an optical illusion that made the animal appear larger and more humanoid than it actually was. The crew's reaction to this explanation was one of incredulous anger. These were experienced outdoorsmen who had worked in remote locations across the western United States. They knew the difference between a moose and whatever they had encountered on the Montana plains. Bill Gray had 30 years of experience in the oil and gas industry, while Dave and Miguel had grown up hunting and fishing in similar terrain. Their collective expertise was being dismissed by someone who had never set foot on their site. The psychological impact on the night shift crew was becoming increasingly severe. What had once been a routine assignment had transformed into a nightly ordeal of tension and fear. Productivity dropped as the workers found themselves constantly distracted by sounds from the darkness beyond their lights. Equipment operators made mistakes they would never have made under normal circumstances, and the overall efficiency of the operation suffered dramatically. Additional incidents continued to plague the site throughout early August. Heavy equipment was found, moved from where it had been parked the previous evening, despite being secured with wheel locks and parking brakes. Strange, musky odors would occasionally drift across the work area, unlike anything the crew had encountered before. Most disturbing were the sounds of metal being manipulated somewhere in the darkness, creaking, scraping noises that suggested their mysterious visitor was examining or testing their equipment. The breaking point came during a shift change on August 8th, when the creature made its closest approach yet to the drilling operation. According to Frank Kitagawa, he was conducting his routine perimeter check when he spotted a massive figure standing motionless near the equipment yard, less than 50 yards from the main drilling platform. For several terrifying minutes, man and creature observed each other across the industrial landscape. Frank later described the encounter as the most frightening experience of his life. The creature stood upright like a human, but was covered in dark, shaggy hair and possessed proportions that were clearly non-human. Its eyes reflected the industrial lighting, which was both fascinating and terrifying. When Frank finally moved to alert the rest of the crew, the creature simply melted back into the darkness with surprising stealth for something so large. Within 1 week of this close encounter, the entire night shift crew had submitted their resignations. Bill Gray, despite his years of experience and professional reputation, refused to spend another night on the site. Dave and Miguel found positions with other drilling companies, while Frank Kitagawa left the security industry entirely. The mass exodus of experienced personnel effectively shut down the night operation. The drilling company's response was swift and comprehensive, though not in the way the crew had hoped. Rather than investigating the mysterious encounters, corporate management suspended the entire operation, citing unspecified equipment issues and safety concerns. All security footage was confiscated by company representatives. However, someone within the organization leaked portions of the dashcam and security camera footage to online forums dedicated to unexplained phenomena. The grainy videos quickly went viral, sparking intense debate among believers and skeptics alike. Some viewers were convinced the footage showed definitive proof of an unknown species, while others maintained that the images could be explained by conventional wildlife or even elaborate hoaxes. The drilling site remains abandoned to this day, its equipment removed, and the access roads gradually being reclaimed by prairie grass. Occasional reports of similar sightings continue to emerge from the surrounding area, though none have been as well documented as the events of July and August 2018. I woke to the screams before I even opened my eyes. Bigfoot had ripped through our camp, and the dogman that hunted with it was even more brutal with the killings. In mere moments, 5 of my camper friends would be dragged into the dark, leaving us fighting for our lives. On the morning of May 5, 2024, I unloaded my pack near the clearing edge and noticed it first. No crickets or birds settling for evening, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The forest around us absorbed sound, like a held breath, and even the wind came in uneven bursts that made no sense for the terrain. The bark on several trees had been stripped away in long vertical gouges, starting about 7 feet up and continuing to nearly 12 feet high. The exposed wood underneath looked old, weathered gray, but the pattern was too uniform to be natural decay. Something tall had scraped those trees, something that did not need to climb to reach that height. We chose a site and unpacked. Ren dropped his gear beside mine and stretched his back, groaning from the weight. Malin and Torin were already staking out tent positions near the center of the clearing, while Sable and Darcy gathered stones for a fire ring. I walked the perimeter while the others worked, ostensibly checking for widowmakers and uneven ground. What I actually noticed made my skin crawl in ways I could not explain. Why did instinct tell me to keep moving instead of calling everyone together right then? Near the northern edge of our site, I found impressions in a patch of soft moss. They were not boot prints. Each depression was roughly 18 inches long and 8 inches wide at the widest point, with 5 distinct toe marks pressed deep into the ground. The stride between them measured at least 6 feet. I crouched beside one and placed my hand inside it for scale. My fingers did not reach the edges. A smell drifted past me then, carrying on one of those inconsistent gusts of wind. Musky and wet, like a dog left too long in the rain, but underneath it was something sharper, almost sulfuric. It made my eyes water. The smell lingered for perhaps 5 seconds, then vanished completely as the wind shifted. I stood and scanned the tree line. The shadows between the trunks seemed to move independently of the branches above them, and I had the sudden irrational certainty that something was watching us from just beyond the reach of the fading daylight. The sensation was so strong that I took 2 steps backward before I could stop myself. Ren called my name from across the clearing. I turned and saw him holding up a camp stove, asking with a gesture whether we should set it up or just use the fire. I waved toward the fire ring and walked back, forcing myself not to look over my shoulder. By the time we had the tents erected and the fire crackling, full darkness had settled over the forest. Our headlamps cast weak, yellowish beams that seemed dimmer than they should have been, as if the darkness here was thicker somehow, more resistant to light. The fire helped, but its reach felt limited, the flames struggling against an invisible pressure. How do you defend a camp when the night itself feels hostile? We ate quickly. Dehydrated meals rehydrated with boiled water, granola bars, jerky. Nobody talked much. Sable made a comment about the quiet, and Malin laughed nervously and said it was peaceful. Torrin said he preferred it to highway noise. But I watched their eyes, and I saw the same unease I felt reflected there. We decided to go to sleep. The fire was reduced to a low bed of coals, barely enough to keep the clearing defined. Headlamps clicked off one by one. Zippers whispered shut. The forest closed in, complete and watchful. At some point, I realized I was fully awake again, not startled, not drifting. Awake in the way you are when your body knows something is wrong before your mind can name it. What had my body sensed that my eyes still could not see? To my left, Torrin's breathing was slow and even. Across the clearing, Sable shifted once in her sleep, nylon rustling softly. Wren's tent sat just beyond mine, close enough that earlier I had heard him roll over, muttering something half-formed and unconscious. I unzipped my tent carefully and sat up. The fire was nothing but a dull red glow, barely illuminating the center of the clearing. The tree line felt closer than it should have been, as though it had crept inward while we slept. Wren's tent was still there. But suddenly, the top of the tent dipped inward as something heavy pressed down from above. A large, flat hand, too broad to be human, forced the fabric down until the pole bowed. Thick fingers found the zipper and pulled it open with slow, careful control. A massive fur-covered arm slid inside. I froze as it pushed its upper body through the opening. Its shoulders filled the tent. It's a Sasquatch. The smell reached me even from where I stood, wet earth and rot. Wren lay on his back, still asleep inside his sleeping bag, one hand resting on his chest. Bigfoot placed one hand over his mouth and nose. Wren's body twitched once in confusion, but never woke. Its other hand slid beneath his neck and tightened. Its thumb pressed hard under his jaw, while its fingers locked behind his skull. It was twisted. The sound was quiet but unmistakable, a wet crack that seemed to travel through the ground as much as the air. Wren's body went limp instantly. Bigfoot held him there for another second, ensuring the stillness was complete. Then it shifted its grip, sliding one arm under his shoulders and another beneath his legs, lifting both Wren and the sleeping bag as a single bundle. A second shape appeared at the entrance. It has a long snout that pushes through the opening, teeth already visible as its lips curled back. A dog man. It sniffed Wren's face once, confirming what the other had done. They dragged Wren's body. Together they moved in practiced silence, keeping the body aligned as they crossed the clearing. Wren's boots stayed behind, still neatly lined up at the tent entrance. I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. They disappeared into the tree line with him between them. I did not say Wren's name. I stood barefoot in the dirt, staring into the darkness, and understood with cold certainty that whatever had taken him had done so without urgency, without much noise, and without leaving anything behind for us to follow. Others seemed to have woken up by the sounds. Sable asked what that was. I told them something about Wren. The forest fell silent again, but the quality of the silence had changed. Before, it felt like absence. Now, it felt like anticipation. We decided to go towards the sound in hopes of finding Wren. I grabbed my headlamp and stood, my heart hammering against my ribs. Torrin stood with me, and then Darcy. Malin was already moving toward the eastern edge, calling Wren's name again, her voice thin and high with rising panic. How far would loyalty push us before fear finally won? We entered the trees together, our headlamps cutting weak tunnels through the darkness. The ground beneath our feet was soft and treacherous, hidden roots and uneven earth threatening to trip us with every step. The smell hit me again, that wet animal musk, stronger now, concentrated. Wren's footprints were easy to follow in the soft needle cover. They led straight into the forest for about 40 feet, moving in a direct line. Darcy found the drag marks 12 feet to the left of Wren's trail. They were shallow grooves in the needle cover, two parallel lines about 3 feet apart, leading deeper into the forest. They continued for maybe 20 feet, then stopped just as abruptly as Wren's footprints. Where they ended, the ground showed signs of disturbance, as if something large had compressed the earth, but there was no clear pattern to it. I noticed the other tracks then. They surrounded us, dozens of them, forming rough circles that overlapped and intersected. The same massive barefoot impressions I had found at camp, but these were fresher, deeper. Some of them were close enough to our own boot prints that they must have been made while we stood in this exact spot, though none of us had heard a sound. If they could move without sound, how long had we been standing inside their reach? I pointed them out without speaking, just aimed my headlamp downward. Everyone looked, and nobody spoke for several seconds. Then a sound broke the silence, a sharp, deliberate knock, wood striking wood with force. It came from somewhere to our north, distant but clear. Another knock answered, this one from the west, closer. Then a third knock, south of us, much closer, maybe 50 feet. Sable grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to hurt. She whispered that we needed to go back to camp. Her voice had lost all pretense of calm. For a fraction of a second, I saw it. Tall, impossibly tall, easily 8 feet, maybe more. Lean and wrong, its proportions too stretched, its limbs too long. Light reflected from eyes set too high and too far apart. Then it was gone, vanished into the darkness with a speed that should not have been possible for something that size. It's a textbook Bigfoot. My bladder nearly released. Torin made a sound in his throat, half gasp, half whimper. He took 2 stumbling steps backward. Malin said we needed to find Wren. She said we could not leave him out here, but her voice had no conviction in it, just desperate denial. Darcy was already moving back toward camp, pulling Sable with her. I followed, and Torin followed me, and finally Malin came too, still looking back over her shoulder, still calling Wren's name into the consuming dark. At what point does the need to save someone become the reason more people die? We searched for 2 hours. We walked grids and spirals, calling until our voices went hoarse. We found nothing. No trace of Wren beyond those truncated footprints and the drag marks that led nowhere. The massive barefoot tracks appeared and disappeared without pattern, sometimes on ground we had already covered, as if whatever made them was circling us, pacing us, always just beyond our lights. The wood knocks continued periodically. They formed a pattern we could not decipher, coming from different directions, different distances. Sometimes they sounded far away. Sometimes they sounded close enough to touch, but we never saw what made them. Twice more I caught glimpses of movement in my headlamp beam. Once it was the same tall, lean shape, there and gone too fast to process. The second time was different. It was larger and broader, too far away to see details, just a massive silhouette that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When I aimed my headlamp directly at it, it simply was not there anymore. If they let themselves be seen, what did they gain by revealing just enough? By midnight, we were stumbling from exhaustion and fear. The forest had become a maze, every tree identical, every direction equally disorienting. Only Torin's compass kept us from losing our bearings completely, and even that seemed unreliable, the needle wavering as if confused by some magnetic interference. We made our way back to camp through sheer luck and determination. The fire had burned down to coals, casting a dull orange glow that seemed pathetically inadequate against the surrounding darkness. Nobody suggested continuing the search. We all understood that searching in this darkness, in this forest, was futile and possibly suicidal. Wren was experienced, we told ourselves. Wren was capable. Wren would survive until morning. We would find him at first light. I approached my tent slowly, my headlamp sweeping across its rainfly. The fabric looked intact, the zippers still closed. Malin was crying softly near her tent. Darcy stood beside her with an arm around her shoulders, murmuring reassurances that sounded hollow and meaningless. Torin and Sable were building up the fire, feeding it every piece of wood they could find, as if enough light could protect us from whatever moved in the darkness beyond. We could only wait for morning and hope we survived that long. If light was our only defense, what happened when it wasn't enough? We retreated to our tents one by one. I crawled into mine fully clothed, boots still on, headlamp within easy reach. The smell of blood was still there, but exhaustion had dulled my ability to care. I lay on top of my sleeping bag and closed my eyes, certain I would not sleep. I was unconscious within minutes. The sound of ripping fabric jerked me awake, with my heart already in overdrive. For a moment, I could not orient myself. Darkness surrounded me, complete and disorienting. Then I remembered the headlamp and fumbled for it, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. Malin screamed. The sound cut through the night, high and piercing and abruptly truncated, as if someone had slapped a hand over her mouth mid-breath. But even as the scream died, I heard the fabric of her tent being torn, a wet ripping sound like meat being pulled from bone. I found my headlamp and switched it on and tore open my tent zipper with such force that I ripped the slider off the track. I spilled out into the clearing and aimed my light toward Malin's tent. Was I about to see proof that we had waited too long to act? An arm extended through the side of it. It was the Sasquatch from earlier. This arm was too thick, too long, covered in dark hair, matted with mud, and something that looked like oil. The hand at the end had 5 fingers, but each one was the length of a human hand, tipped with nails that looked like yellowed bone. As I watched, frozen in place by horror and disbelief, those fingers flexed and grabbed hold of the tent fabric from the inside and pulled. The entire side of the tent came away like tissue paper. Malin's sleeping bag shifted slightly, but she remained asleep, completely unaware. The arm slid further inside, impossibly long, those massive fingers closing around her torso. In one smooth motion, she was lifted from the tent, the bag sagging under her weight. I caught a glimpse of her face for a heartbeat, pale, slack, eyes closed, lips parted as if still dreaming. Then the dogman lunged from the opposite side, grabbing hold of her legs and anchoring her. Her body went rigid for a moment under their coordinated grip, but she never woke, never made a sound. Both Bigfoot and dogman retreated immediately, dragging Malin's body between them. I saw it for just a moment in my headlamp beam, her head hanging at an angle that necks were not designed to accommodate, her arms trailing limply. Then the darkness swallowed them completely, and the only evidence of what had happened was the destroyed tent and the blood and the silence that rushed back in like water, filling a void. Someone was screaming. I realized after several seconds that it was Darcy. She had emerged from her tent and stood perhaps 10 feet away, her headlamp beam jerking wildly as she turned in frantic circles. Torin and Sable were also outside now, both of them frozen in place, their faces slack with shock. I tried to speak, but my throat had closed. I swallowed and forced words out, telling them to run, to move, to get away from the tents. My voice sounded distant and strange, like it belonged to someone else. Was running still a choice, or the only thing left to do? We ran. There was no plan, no discussion of direction or strategy. We simply fled into the forest, headlamps bouncing, feet stumbling over roots and rocks, branches whipping at our faces. Behind us, I heard wood knocks starting up again, that deliberate rhythmic pounding that had stalked us during our search for Wren. Ahead of me, Torin suddenly veered left, shouting something I could not make out over the sound of my own breathing. I followed him and saw why he had turned. A tree lay across our path, freshly fallen, its trunk still releasing the smell of sap. The fall had been recent, very recent, possibly within the last few seconds. We scrambled around it and kept running. Another tree fell ahead of us, maybe 40 feet away. I saw it going down, watched it topple in impossible slow motion, its trunk splintering near the base with a crack like thunder. It crashed across our path with enough force that I felt the impact through the soles of my boots. We were being herded. The realization came with cold clarity. These trees were not falling randomly. They were being pushed over, placed deliberately to block certain routes and force us in a specific direction. Whatever was out there, it was controlling where we went. If they were steering us, where were they taking us? A branch snapped at head height just behind me, close enough that I felt the displacement of air against my neck. I ducked instinctively and stumbled, nearly fell, caught myself against a tree trunk. When I looked back, I saw it. The lean one, the dog man. It stood perhaps 20 feet behind us, its form barely visible in the overlapping beams of our headlamps. Tall, at least 7 feet, with legs that bent wrong, digitigrade, ending in massive paws. Its torso was too narrow, its arms too long. The head was wolf-like, but the proportions were distorted, the snout too blunt, the skull too large. When it opened its mouth, I saw rows of teeth designed for one purpose only. It did not attack. It just stood there, watching us, waiting. But what for? Then it took one step forward, and we ran again. It stayed behind us, maintaining a constant distance, appearing periodically in our headlamp beams when we looked back. It was herding us like a sheepdog, moving us in the direction it wanted us to go. And somewhere ahead, or to the side, or above, I knew Bigfoot waited. Sable went down hard, her foot catching on something I did not see. She hit the ground with a cry that was equal parts pain and terror. We stopped and pulled her back to her feet, and I saw blood on her shin where she had scraped it against a rock. In the brief pause, I realized we had been driven into a part of the forest that was different from the rest. The trees here grew impossibly close together, their trunks forming a maze of vertical barriers. Underbrush choked the spaces between them, thick tangles of fern and salal and devil's club that would be almost impossible to push through in darkness. There was only one clear path forward, a narrow corridor between the trees that led deeper into the forest. We had been funneled into it with surgical precision. I looked back the way we had come and saw the dogman still there, still watching, still waiting. We chose forward because it was the only choice that felt like movement. The corridor between the trees led us into a small depression ringed by boulders and fallen logs. The ground here was relatively clear, carpeted in moss and ferns. It looked almost peaceful in our headlamp beams, a natural shelter from the chaos of the forest. Was this a refuge or a place meant to hold us still? We collapsed there, all four of us, our legs finally giving out from exhaustion and terror. Nobody spoke. We sat with our backs against the boulders, headlamps aimed outward, watching the darkness for movement. The forest had gone silent again. No wood knocks, no sound of pursuit, nothing but our ragged breathing and the hammering of my heart in my ears. When hunters go quiet, is it because they've lost interest or because they're close enough not to need sound? Minutes passed. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving behind a hollow exhaustion that was even worse than the fear. My eyelids felt like they had weights attached, dragging themselves closed despite my efforts to keep them open. Around me, the others were experiencing the same thing. Sable's head had dropped forward onto her chest. Torin's eyes were glazed and unfocused. Darcy kept blinking slowly, like someone fighting off sedation. I knew we should not sleep. Every rational part of my brain screamed warnings about closing my eyes in this place, with those things still out there in the darkness. But rationality had no power over the body's limits. We had been awake for nearly 24 hours, had hiked 8 miles, had spent hours searching for Wren, had run for our lives through hostile terrain. Exhaustion was not a choice, it was a biological imperative. My eyes closed. The darkness behind my eyelids felt almost welcoming, a respite from horror, so I slept. Was that relief the last mercy I would be given? When I woke, I knew immediately that something was wrong. The quality of the silence had changed again. It felt expectant, pregnant with terrible meaning. I opened my eyes and reached for my headlamp, found it still strapped to my head, but switched off. I clicked it on. Torin and Sable were still there, but not for long. In the faint glow of my beam, I saw them jerk violently awake as shadowy figures lunged from the darkness. The Bigfoot moved first, massive and precise, pinning Torin with one enormous hand while the dogman sprang beside it, teeth bared. There was no struggle, only a gasp, a snap, and then Torin's body went limp. The dogman lifted him effortlessly, his head swinging grotesquely to one side. Sable never fully woke. She twitched, eyelids fluttering as the same pair descended on her. The Bigfoot's arm clamped around her torso, lifting her clean off the moss, while the dogman's jaws closed on her shoulder with a sickening crunch. A faint, strangled scream escaped her lips, cut off instantly. In less than 10 seconds, she was gone, dragged backward into the blackness. Only Darcy remained, still sleeping against a boulder 3 feet away from me. Her headlamp was off, and in the beam of mine, I could see her face pale, her mouth slightly open as she breathed, unaware of the horror that had just unfolded. My body froze. I could see the slight impressions in the moss where Torin and Sable had lain, the scuff marks where they'd been yanked away. No noise, no fight, nothing but the echoes of sudden death. The faint metallic scent of blood carried on the still air, sharp and undeniable. It came from somewhere ahead, deeper in the forest, past the ring of boulders. Every instinct screamed to run, but the question remained. Did following that smell mean answers, or the end of us? I knew I should wake Darcy immediately. I knew we needed to move, to run, to put distance between ourselves and this place. But something compelled me forward, some awful need to know what had happened to Torin and Sable. I walked toward the smell. The forest opened into a clearing about 60 feet from where we had slept. The trees here formed a rough circle, their trunks spaced widely enough that my headlamp beam could penetrate to the far side. In the center of the clearing stood 3 particularly large firs, their lowest branches starting about 15 feet above the ground. Torin and Sable hung in those branches. My brain refused to process what I was seeing at first. It tried to convince me I was looking at sleeping bags, or packs, or anything other than what dangled there in the beam of my headlamp. But denial only lasted a few seconds before reality forced itself through. They had been positioned deliberately, their bodies impaled on sharpened branches that had been broken off at precise lengths and angles. Torin hung in the leftmost tree, his arms spread wide, his head tilted back at an angle that exposed his throat. Something had opened him from sternum to pelvis, and his intestines hung in glistening loops that swayed slightly in a breeze I could not feel. What kind of intelligence stages death like a message? Sable was in the middle tree, her body bent backward over a thick branch, her spine clearly broken. Her eyes were open, staring at nothing with the flat dullness of death. Blood had run down the trunk beneath her, pooling in the bark's natural channels before dripping to the forest floor below. Darcy stood at the edge of the clearing, her headlamp beam joining mine to illuminate the horror in the trees. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her face had gone the color of old snow. I grabbed Darcy's arm and pulled her toward me. She stumbled, nearly fell, caught herself. Her breathing had become rapid and shallow, the beginning of hyperventilation. I shook her once, hard, and told her we had to run. The forest erupted with sound behind us. Wood knocks, multiple sources, creating a cacophony that seemed to come from all directions simultaneously. Branch snaps and heavy footfalls, and that wet-breathing sound that had haunted us since Wren's disappearance. If they were this close, why let us run at all? Darcy was crying as she ran, making small, gasping sounds with each breath. Her headlamp had come loose and hung askew on her head, its beam pointing uselessly at the sky. She stumbled constantly, her coordination failing as terror and fatigue overwhelmed her system. We topped a rise and plunged down the far side, sliding on loose needles and mud. At the bottom, my foot caught on something and I went down hard, my shoulder slamming into a tree trunk with enough force that white sparks exploded across my vision. I tried to stand, and my legs would not cooperate. They had finally given out completely, the muscles pushed beyond their limits. I managed to get to my hands and knees, but when I tried to rise further, my thighs simply trembled and refused to lift me. It was the same for Darcy. If neither of us could stand, what hope remained? Exhaustion won. I don't remember deciding to sleep. I remember sitting against a tree with my pack still on, my legs trembling too badly to stand anymore. Darcy curled a few feet away, with her knees drawn to her chest. The forest had gone quiet again. Not normal quiet, but that same pressed, listening silence. We told each other we'd rest for just a few minutes, catch our breath, then we'd move. I woke to something brushing my face. At first I thought it was rain or leaves falling, but it was too deliberate, a slow drag across my cheek. I jerked upright with a sharp intake of breath, my heart already racing before my mind caught up. The dog man appeared beside me, close enough that I could smell the rot on its breath. It just stood there, watching, blocking my path. When I tried to move around it, it shifted position to stay between me and the Bigfoot. I was meant to watch. That realization came with horrible clarity. I was being forced to witness what happened next. The Bigfoot held Darcy at arm's length, studying her with what looked like curiosity. She was still asleep. The creature tilted its head, first one way, then the other, as if considering something. Was it deciding how to kill her, or whether she was worth killing at all? Then it brought her closer and opened its mouth. The teeth were massive, yellowed and worn, but still functional. Not the specialized fangs of a carnivore, but the broad, crushing teeth of an omnivore, capable of tearing through meat and grinding through bone with equal efficiency. It bit into Darcy's shoulder. The sound of tearing flesh was loud in the quiet forest. Darcy found her voice again, screaming with renewed energy as blood sprayed from the wound. The Bigfoot pulled back, taking a chunk of her shoulder with it, and chewed slowly, deliberately, while Darcy thrashed in its grip. It took another bite, then another, methodical and unhurried, eating her alive while she screamed and bled and begged in words that dissolved into incoherent wailing. I do not know when I closed my eyes. I do not know when my mind finally broke enough to let me look away. But at some point the screaming stopped, replaced by wet, consuming sounds that continued for several minutes. When silence finally returned, I opened my eyes. Bigfoot stood 30 feet away, barely visible in the weak beam of my fallen headlamp. Blood covered its hands and chest and face, black in the dim light. It was watching me again, had probably been watching me the entire time. The dogman still stood beside me, close enough to touch, making no aggressive moves, just waiting. The Bigfoot took a step toward me, then another. It moved slowly, each footfall deliberate and heavy. It closed the distance between us until it stood directly in front of me, so close that I could feel heat radiating from its massive body. It leaned down, bringing its face level with mine. It looked at me for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Then it straightened, turned, and walked away into the forest. The dogman followed, both creatures disappearing into the darkness with the same silence they had emerged from. The thought came slowly, fighting through the shock that had numbed my brain. It had killed Malin, Torin, Sable, and Darcy. It had taken Wren, but it had looked at me and chosen not to kill me. Not because I fought well, or because I was lucky, or because it was satisfied. It let me go because it wanted a witness. It wanted someone to walk out of those woods and carry the story, to spread the knowledge that there are places humans do not belong, and things in the darkness that will enforce that boundary with absolute violence. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.